The moment General Harrison's voice echoed across the church courtyard asking for Colonel Miller, every conversation stopped. But what made my blood run cold wasn't the authority in his voice or the sea of uniforms that suddenly turned toward us. It was the look of complete confusion on my sister's face when she realized he was talking about me. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The morning of little Tommy's baptism started like any other family gathering I'd learned to navigate with careful precision. I arrived at St. Michael's Lutheran Church 30 minutes early, not out of enthusiasm, but because I knew exactly where I needed to sit to avoid the inevitable questions about my life that I wasn't ready to answer. The back left pew, third row from the wall, close enough to show I cared, far enough to slip out quietly if needed. It had become my signature spot at family events over the past 3 years. My sister Rebecca was already there, fussing over Tommy's christening gown, while her husband Mark tried to wrangle their older daughter, 6-year-old Sophie, who was determined to climb on every available surface. Rebecca caught my eye and waved me over, but I held up my phone and mouthed "important call" before settling into my chosen seat. It wasn't entirely a lie. I did have my phone in my hand, though the only calls I'd been receiving lately were from bill collectors and my landlord asking about next month's rent. The church filled up quickly with aunts, uncles, cousins, and family friends I recognized but hadn't spoken to in years. My mother, Patricia, swept in wearing her best navy dress and immediately began directing people like she was orchestrating a wedding. She spotted me in the back, and her mouth formed a thin line of disapproval, but the ceremony was about to begin, so she couldn't march over and relocate me to the family section. Father Martinez began the service with his usual warm smile and gentle voice. Tommy, blissfully unaware of the significance of the day, gurgled happily in Rebecca's arms. For a moment, watching my nephew's innocent face, I felt a small crack in the wall I'd built around myself. He represented possibility, hope, all the things I used to believe in before everything fell apart. The ceremony proceeded beautifully. Tommy barely fussed when the holy water touched his forehead, and Sophie managed to sit still long enough for the important parts. I found myself genuinely smiling for the first time in weeks, lost in the simple joy of the moment. Then came the reception. The church had a lovely courtyard area with round tables covered in white linens and small bouquets of daisies. Rebecca had clearly put thought into every detail, from the elegant place cards to the 3-tiered cake decorated with tiny angels. It should have been perfect. I grabbed a plate of finger sandwiches and a glass of lemonade, then surveyed the scene. The family tables were clearly marked, but I wasn't sure where I belonged anymore. 3 years ago, I would have been at the head table, probably giving a speech about being the proud aunt. Now, I felt like a stranger at my own nephew's baptism. I found a small table near the garden wall, partially hidden by a large oak tree. It seated 4, but I hoped it would remain empty enough for me to eat in peace. The view was nice from there. I could watch Sophie chase butterflies while the adults talked and laughed at their respective tables. My strategy worked for about 20 minutes. I managed to eat half my sandwich and listen to Father Martinez's blessing without anyone bothering me. A few relatives waved from across the courtyard, and I waved back with what I hoped looked like a genuine smile. Then my cousin David approached with his wife Jennifer and their twin boys. "Sarah, there you are," David said, pulling out a chair without being invited. "We've been looking all over for you." Jennifer smiled apologetically as she corralled the twins. "David insisted we had to catch up with you. It's been so long since we've seen you at a family event." My stomach tightened. This was exactly what I'd been trying to avoid. David had always been the family questioner, the one who remembered everyone's business and expected detailed updates. "How's the Air Force treating you?" he continued, settling in with his own plate. "Mom said you made colonel last year. That's incredible, Sarah. We're all so proud." The lemonade turned bitter in my mouth. I glanced around the courtyard, hoping for some distraction or escape route. It's going well," I managed. "Are you stationed locally now? It's so great that you could make it today without having to fly in from somewhere exotic." Jennifer elbowed David gently. "Honey, maybe Sarah doesn't want to talk about work at a family gathering." But David was on a roll. "Come on, Jen, our Sarah is a decorated Air Force colonel. That's something to celebrate. Remember when we were kids, Sarah, and you used to line up all your dolls like little soldiers? We always knew you'd end up in uniform. I forced a laugh, but it came out hollow. Kids have wild imaginations. So where are you stationed now? Still flying? David's eyes lit up with genuine curiosity and pride. The questions kept coming, each one tightening the knot in my chest. I mumbled something about classified information and tried to change the subject to his sons, but David was persistent. He'd always looked up to me as the successful one in the family, the one who'd made something of herself while he settled into a comfortable but unremarkable life as an insurance adjuster. Finally, I excused myself to use the restroom, but instead of going inside, I slipped around the side of the church building where a small memorial garden provided some privacy. I leaned against the stone wall and tried to steady my breathing. This was why I'd been avoiding family gatherings. Everyone still saw me as Colonel Sarah Miller. Decorated pilot. Successful military officer. They had no idea that Colonel Miller had been dishonorably discharged 8 months ago. They didn't know about the incident that ended my career. The investigation. The shame that followed me like a shadow. I'd been living off my meager savings ever since, too proud to tell my family the truth and too ashamed to ask for help. Rebecca thought I was taking some well-deserved leave time. My mother assumed I was between assignments. Everyone had theories, but no one knew the reality of my small, dingy apartment and the stack of overdue bills on my kitchen table. The sound of footsteps on gravel made me look up. Mark, Rebecca's husband, rounded the corner with a concerned expression. "Sarah, you okay? Rebecca sent me to check on you." Mark had always been perceptive, one of the few people who didn't just accept surface-level answers. It's probably why Rebecca married him. "Just needed some air," I said, straightening up and trying to look composed. He studied my face for a moment. Family gatherings can be overwhelming. All those questions, all those expectations. I nodded, grateful that he wasn't pushing for details. "You know," Mark continued, "Rebecca worries about you. She says you've seemed distant lately, different." "I'm fine, Mark. Just busy with work stuff." He didn't look convinced, but he didn't press either. "Well, if you ever need to talk, or if there's anything Rebecca and I can do." "Thanks. I appreciate it." We walked back toward the reception together, but I could feel his sideways glances. Mark was putting pieces together, and I wasn't sure how long I could keep up the facade. The reception was in full swing when we returned. Someone had brought out a guitar, and a small group was singing children's songs for Sophie and the other kids. Tommy was being passed around from relative to relative, each one marveling at how much he'd grown. I retook my seat at the small table, hoping David had moved on to interrogate someone else. The afternoon sun was getting warmer, and the laughter and conversation created a pleasant buzz around the courtyard. For a moment I allowed myself to imagine what it would be like to actually belong here again, to be part of this normal, happy family scene without the weight of my secrets. That's when I saw the black sedan pull up to the church parking lot. The black sedan's tinted windows revealed nothing, but everything about the vehicle screamed official business. My chest constricted as I watched two figures emerge from the car. The driver was clearly military. His posture gave it away even in civilian clothes. But it was the passenger who made my hands start trembling. 3 stars gleamed on the shoulder boards of his dress blues, even from this distance. A general. At my nephew's baptism. They approached the church entrance with purpose, and I instinctively sank lower in my chair, using the oak tree as cover. Maybe they were here for someone else. Maybe this had nothing to do with me. Maybe I was paranoid, and they were just distant relatives I didn't recognize. The general paused at the entrance to the courtyard, his eyes scanning the crowd methodically. He was older, probably in his 60s, with silver hair and the kind of bearing that commanded attention without effort. When his gaze swept over my section, I held my breath and looked down at my plate. Rebecca appeared at his side almost immediately, her hostess instincts kicking in. I couldn't hear their conversation from my position, but I saw her gesture toward different tables, clearly trying to help him locate someone. The general nodded politely, but continued his visual search. That's when David spotted them, and, being David, immediately assumed they were there to honor me. "Oh my God," he said loudly enough for half the courtyard to hear. "That's a general. He must be here for Sarah." He started waving enthusiastically in their direction. "Over here! Colonel Miller is over here!" The blood drained from my face. Several family members turned to look at me with curious smiles, clearly thinking this was some wonderful surprise recognition. My mother's face lit up with pride from across the courtyard. The general's head snapped in my direction and our eyes met across the crowded reception. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his gaze that made my skin crawl. Recognition, but not the good kind. He began walking toward me with measured steps, his aide following closely behind. With each step, my panic grew. I considered running, but my legs felt like lead. Besides, where would I go? This was my family's celebration, and I'd already caused enough disruption in my life. "Excuse me," the general said as he approached my table, his voice carrying the authority of decades in command. "Are you Colonel Sarah Miller?" The entire courtyard had gone quiet. Even the children seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere. I could feel dozens of eyes on me, waiting for my response. I started, then cleared my throat. "I used to be." His eyebrows raised slightly. "Used to be? That's an interesting way to put it." He glanced around at the watching crowd, then back at me. "Perhaps we could speak privately?" Rebecca hurried over, practically glowing with excitement. "General, this is such an honor. Sarah, you didn't tell us you were expecting military visitors today. This is wonderful." The general's expression softened slightly as he looked at Rebecca. "Ma'am, I apologize for interrupting what appears to be a beautiful celebration. This is a family matter that requires a brief conversation with Ms. Miller." "Of course. Sarah, you can use the church office if you need privacy. Father Martinez won't mind." Rebecca was beaming, clearly thinking this was some kind of commendation or medal presentation. I stood on unsteady legs, my napkin falling to the ground. That's very kind, Rebecca." The walk to the church office felt like a death march. The general walked beside me while his aide trailed behind, and I was acutely aware that every family member was watching our procession with barely contained curiosity. My mother actually applauded softly as we passed her table. Father Martinez's office was small but comfortable, with religious artwork on the walls and a large wooden desk covered in papers. The general waited for me to sit before taking the chair across from me. His aide remained standing by the door. "Colonel Miller," the general began, then paused. "Or do you prefer Ms. Miller now?" "Ms. Miller is fine." He studied me for a long moment. "I'm General Harrison, and I believe you know why I'm here." My mouth went dry. "I'm not sure I do." 8 months ago, you were dishonorably discharged from the United States Air Force following an incident involving the unauthorized disclosure of classified materials to a foreign national. The discharge was kept quiet at the request of your former commanding officer, Colonel Patricia Vance, who felt your previous service record warranted some discretion. Each word hit me like a physical blow. Hearing it spoken aloud, in this sacred place where my nephew had just been baptized, felt like a violation of everything good left in my world. "Since your discharge," General Harrison continued, "you've been living under false pretenses, allowing your family to believe you're still an active duty officer. You've been using your former military connections to obtain employment references, and just last week, you applied for a position with a defense contractor using credentials you no longer possess." I wanted to defend myself, to explain that I'd only applied for that job out of desperation, that I needed the money to avoid eviction, but the words wouldn't come. "The foreign national in question," he said, his voice growing colder, "was Lieutenant Chen Wei of the People's Liberation Army, whom you were romantically involved with while stationed in Germany. You provided her with flight patterns and maintenance schedules for 3 separate missions." "It wasn't like that," I whispered. "Then enlighten me. What was it like?" The memories flooded back unbidden. Wei had been so charming, so interested in American culture. We'd met at a cultural exchange event, and she'd seemed genuinely fascinated by my work as a pilot. The information I'd shared had seemed harmless at the time, just shop talk between professionals. I hadn't realized she was intelligence gathering until it was too late. I thought she cared about me. I didn't know who she really was until the investigation began." "Ignorance isn't a defense, Ms. Miller. You violated your oath, compromised national security, and betrayed the trust of every service member who depends on operational security." "I know," I said, my voice barely audible, I know what I did. General Harrison leaned back in his chair. The question now is what we do about your current situation. Your family clearly has no idea about your discharge, and you've been living a lie for months. Are you going to tell them? That depends on you. I looked up, confused. The defense contractor position you applied for belongs to a company that does significant work with the Air Force. Your application triggered a security flag, which is how you came to my attention. Your former commanding officer, Colonel Vance, has been keeping tabs on you. Patricia is keeping tabs on me? She feels responsible for your situation. She believes that with proper supervision and accountability, you might be able to contribute something meaningful to your country again. Not as a military officer, that door is permanently closed, but as a civilian with valuable experience. My heart began beating faster. What are you saying? I'm saying there might be a path forward for you, Ms. Miller, but it requires complete honesty moving forward. No more lies, no more deception. If you want a second chance, it starts with telling your family the truth about who you really are now. Through the office window, I could see the baptism reception continuing in the courtyard. Sophie was chasing bubbles while the adults chatted and laughed. Tommy was sleeping peacefully in my mother's arms. It looked so normal, so perfect. And if I refuse? General Harrison's expression hardened. Then I make some phone calls, and by tomorrow morning, your fraudulent job applications become a federal matter. You'll be facing charges for identity fraud and misrepresentation on federal documents. The room felt like it was closing in around me. After months of living in limbo, pretending everything was fine while my world crumbled privately, I was finally facing a moment of truth. How long do I have to decide? You don't, he stood up, straightening his uniform. Because we're walking back out there together, and you're going to tell your family who you really are. Today, now. General, please. Ms. Miller, your nephew was just baptized into a faith that values honesty, redemption, and second chances. Don't you think it's time you embrace those values yourself? The weight of his words settled over me like a heavy blanket. Through the window, I could see Rebecca laughing at something Mark had said while she bounced Tommy gently in her arms. My mother was showing Sophie how to fold her napkin into a flower. David was regaling a table full of cousins with some animated story. They all thought I was Colonel Sarah Miller, decorated war hero, successful military officer. In a few minutes, they'd learn I was just Sarah Miller, disgraced former officer, unemployed and nearly homeless. But maybe, for the first time in 8 months, I'd also be honest. The walk back to the courtyard felt endless. Each step on the stone path echoed in my ears like a countdown to my own execution. General Harrison walked beside me with military precision, while his aide maintained a respectful distance behind us. I could already see curious faces turning our way as we emerged from the church. Rebecca spotted us first and practically bounced on her toes with excitement. She'd clearly spent the last 20 minutes building up anticipation among the family members, probably spinning elaborate theories about medals or promotions. The disappointment she was about to face made my stomach lurch. "Sarah," she called out as we approached, "is everything all right?" We were all wondering what kind of wonderful news the general brought. The entire reception had reorganized itself around our return. Family members had abandoned their scattered conversations and formed a loose semicircle, all facing toward us with expectant smiles. My mother held Tommy protectively but proudly, clearly ready to hear about her daughter's latest achievement. David had his phone out, probably ready to record whatever announcement was coming. "Actually," General Harrison said, his voice carrying across the courtyard, "I think Ms. Miller has something she'd like to share with all of you." Every eye in the courtyard fixed on me. The afternoon sun suddenly felt scorching, and I could feel sweat forming under my dress despite the pleasant weather. Sophie stopped chasing butterflies and wandered over, sensing that something important was happening. I started, then stopped. "How do you destroy everything your family believes about you in front of a 3-tiered baptism cake?" "Take your time," General Harrison said quietly, but there was steel beneath his gentle tone. Rebecca moved closer, her maternal instincts kicking in as she noticed my distress. "Sarah, honey, what's wrong? You look pale." Mark stepped up beside his wife, his earlier suspicions clearly confirmed by my obvious panic. "Maybe we should sit down," he suggested. "No," I said, finding my voice. "No. Everyone should hear this." I looked around at all the faces. Aunts, uncles, cousins, family friends who had known me since I was Sophie's age. They'd watched me grow up, celebrated my graduation from the Air Force Academy, sent care packages during my deployments. They'd been so proud when I made captain, then major, then colonel. 8 months ago, I began, my voice shaking. I was dishonorably discharged from the United States Air Force. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. My mother was the first to react. "What? Sarah, that's not possible. You just got promoted to colonel last year." "I did get promoted to colonel, and then I lost it all." David lowered his phone, his face confused. "Lost it how? What happened?" General Harrison stepped slightly forward. Ms. Miller was involved in an incident that resulted in the unauthorized disclosure of classified information to a foreign national. The discharge was processed quietly due to her previous service record. "Classified information?" My mother's voice was barely a whisper. "Sarah, what is he talking about?" The weight of their stares was crushing. I could see the exact moment understanding began to dawn on different faces. Confusion giving way to shock, then disappointment, then something worse. Betrayal. "There was a woman," I said, forcing myself to continue. "Someone I thought I loved. I didn't know she was Chinese intelligence until it was too late. I shared information about flight schedules and maintenance reports. I thought it was just conversation, shop talk." "You gave military secrets to the Chinese?" Uncle Robert's voice boomed across the courtyard. He was a Vietnam veteran who had never quite forgiven the world for changing after his war. "It wasn't like that," I said desperately. "I didn't know." "You didn't know?" His face was turning red. "You're a colonel in the United States Air Force, and you didn't know better than to discuss classified material with a foreign national?" "Robert," my mother said sharply, but her voice lacked its usual authority. Rebecca looked like someone had slapped her. "Sarah, please tell me this is some kind of mistake, some kind of misunderstanding." "I wish it were." "So when you said you were taking leave time..." Mark's voice trailed off as he put the pieces together. "I've been unemployed for 8 months, living off savings that ran out 3 months ago." The revelation hit the crowd like a physical wave. Conversations erupted in hushed whispers as family members tried to process what they were hearing. I caught fragments. "Can't believe it. How could she? All this time." Sophie tugged on her mother's dress. "Mommy, why is everyone sad? Why is Aunt Sarah crying?" I hadn't realized I was crying until she pointed it out. Rebecca automatically picked up Sophie, shielding her from the adult drama unfolding around them. "Ms. Miller," General Harrison said, "would you like to tell them about the job application?" I closed my eyes. Each revelation felt like another shovelful of dirt being thrown on my grave. Last week I applied for a civilian position with a defense contractor. I used my old credentials, my old rank. It triggered a security investigation. "You've been committing fraud?" David's voice cracked with disbelief. "Identity fraud," General Harrison clarified. "Misrepresentation on federal employment documents. These are serious federal crimes." My mother suddenly looked very old. She was still holding Tommy, but her grip had loosened, and Mark quickly moved to take his son from her unsteady hands. "All those times you called," she said slowly, "all those conversations about your career, your assignments, you were lying to me? To all of us?" "Mom, I wanted to tell you..." "For 8 months, Sarah? You let me brag to my friends about my daughter, the colonel, for 8 months, while you were, what? Sitting in some apartment, lying to everyone who loves you?" The hurt in her voice was worse than Uncle Robert's anger, worse than David's shock. It was the sound of trust breaking. "I was ashamed," I whispered. "So you thought lying was better?" Rebecca's voice was sharp now, her protective mother instincts extending beyond just Sophie. "Do you have any idea how worried we've been? How many times I called and you brushed me off? I thought you were dealing with classified missions or PTSD or something serious." "This is serious," I said weakly. "This is selfish," she shot back. "You let us all believe a fantasy while you were in trouble. Real trouble. We could have helped you." "How? How were you going to help me with a dishonorable discharge?" "We could have been there for you," Rebecca's voice broke. "We could have supported you instead of..." Instead of this. Instead of finding out at my son's baptism that my sister is a liar and a criminal. The word criminal hung in the air like a physical presence. That's what I was now, officially. Not a decorated veteran, not a successful officer, but a criminal who had betrayed her country and her family. General Harrison cleared his throat. There's more to discuss. More? I couldn't imagine what else there was to reveal. I'd already destroyed every relationship that mattered to me. Ms. Miller's former commanding officer, Colonel Vance, has proposed an alternative to federal prosecution, a kind of second chance, but it comes with conditions. What kind of conditions? Mark asked. He was the only one who seemed capable of rational thought at the moment. Complete honesty moving forward. No more deception of any kind. Ms. Miller would work as a civilian consultant, under strict supervision, helping to identify and prevent the kind of security breaches that led to her own downfall. She would essentially become a case study in how good people make terrible decisions. You want her to relive her mistakes professionally? Rebecca asked incredulously. We want her to help prevent others from making the same mistakes. Her insights could be valuable in training and security protocols. I looked around at my family, really looked at them. The disappointment was written across every face, but underneath it, I could see something else. They were still here. They were still listening. Even after everything I'd just revealed, they hadn't walked away. And if I refuse this offer? I asked. Then we proceed with federal charges. Fraud, misrepresentation, and we reopen the original investigation to see if there were any other security breaches we missed. Tommy started fussing in Mark's arms, as if he could sense the tension around him. Mark bounced him gently, and for a moment, we all watched the innocent baby who had no idea that his baptism day had turned into his aunt's judgment day. I need time to think, I said. No, General Harrison replied firmly. You've had 8 months to think. You've had 8 months to make this right with your family, and instead, you chose to compound the lies. The offer expires when I leave this courtyard. The ultimatum settled over us like a storm cloud. This was it, the moment that would determine whether I had any future at all, with my country or my family. The weight of General Harrison's ultimatum pressed down on the courtyard like a physical force. Every family member stood frozen, waiting for my response to a decision that would determine not just my future, but how they would remember this day forever. Tommy's soft gurgling was the only sound breaking the silence. He reached his tiny hand toward the sunlight filtering through the oak leaves, completely oblivious to the fact that his baptism had become the backdrop for his aunt's potential redemption or final downfall. Sarah, my mother said quietly, stepping closer. Her voice had lost its earlier sharpness, replaced by something I hadn't heard in years, the tone she used when I was little and had nightmares. What exactly would this consulting position involve? General Harrison glanced at me, then addressed my mother directly. Ma'am, your daughter would work with our security training division, helping develop protocols to prevent insider threats. She would share her experience, both the mistakes and the warning signs, with current service members and security personnel. You want her to confess her failures professionally, Uncle Robert said with obvious disgust, turn her shame into a career. I want her to prevent others from making the same devastating choices, General Harrison replied calmly. Ms. Miller's case isn't unique. Every year we lose good people to foreign intelligence operations that exploit personal relationships. Her insights could save careers, lives, and national security. Rebecca shifted Sophie to her other hip, her expression thoughtful despite her earlier anger. What kind of supervision are we talking about? Complete financial transparency, regular psychological evaluations, restricted travel. She would essentially be on professional probation for the rest of her career, but it would be a career nonetheless. And if she fails to meet these conditions? Mark asked. Then the original charges are filed, and she faces federal prosecution. I found myself studying the faces around me, seeing them differently than I had just an hour ago. These people had loved Colonel Sarah Miller, the successful military officer who sent birthday cards on time and called during holidays to share carefully edited stories about her important work. But who would love Sarah Miller, the disgraced former officer who had betrayed everything she'd sworn to protect? I have a question, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. Colonel Vance, Why would she stick her neck out for me, after what I did? General Harrison's expression softened slightly. She believes in second chances. And she believes that good people can recover from terrible mistakes if they're willing to do the hard work of earning back trust. But I'll never be able to serve again. Not really serve. No, you won't. You'll never wear the uniform again, never pilot military aircraft, never hold security clearance above the most basic level. But you might be able to help ensure other young officers don't follow your path. David, who had been unusually quiet since the revelations began, suddenly spoke up. Wait a minute. Sarah, where have you been living these past 8 months? The question caught me off guard. What do you mean? You said your savings ran out 3 months ago. You're unemployed. Where have you been living? Heat crept up my neck. Even now, there were more humiliating truths to reveal. A studio apartment in Riverside Heights. Month-to-month lease. My mother's intake of breath was sharp. Riverside Heights was known for being the kind of place people lived when they had no other options. Jesus, Sarah, Rebecca whispered. You've been living in that neighborhood alone while we thought you were on some classified assignment? How bad is it? Mark asked gently. Bad enough that I applied for that fraudulent job because I'm 2 weeks away from eviction. The admission hung in the air like a confession at an altar. Here, in this sacred place where my nephew had just been welcomed into a community of faith and love, I was laying bare just how completely I'd fallen. My mother suddenly stepped forward and did something I didn't expect. She reached out and took my hand. Sweetheart, she said, her voice thick with emotion, why didn't you come to us? Because I was Colonel Miller. I was supposed to be the successful one, the one who had it all figured out. How could I come home and tell you that I'd thrown it all away for someone who was using me? Because we're your family, Rebecca said, tears streaming down her face. Because that's what families do. Sophie, sensing her mother's distress, began to whimper. Rebecca absently stroked her daughter's hair while keeping her eyes fixed on me. All those times you canceled dinner plans, all those brief phone calls, you were protecting us from your reality? I was protecting myself from your disappointment. Well, congratulations, Uncle Robert said bitterly. Mission accomplished. Robert, enough, my mother snapped, her protective instincts finally overriding her shock. General Harrison checked his watch. Ms. Miller, I need your decision. The offer won't remain open indefinitely. I looked around the courtyard one more time. The beautiful decorations Rebecca had chosen, the remains of the celebration meal, the cake with its tiny angel decorations, all of it seemed to belong to a different world now, a world where families gathered to celebrate new beginnings without the shadow of betrayal and disgrace. But maybe that's what baptism was really about, not perfection but the possibility of starting over after you'd made a mess of everything. If I take this position, I said slowly, will I be able to rebuild, not my military career? I understand that's over, but my life, my relationships. That depends on you, General Harrison replied, and on them. He gestured toward my family. I turned to Rebecca first. I know I've lost your trust. I know this day is ruined because of me. But if I take this chance, if I try to make things right, is there any possibility that someday you might forgive me? Rebecca looked down at Sophie, then at Tommy in Mark's arms. When she looked back at me, her eyes were still wet, but there was something resolute in her expression. You're Sophie's aunt, you're Tommy's aunt. That doesn't change no matter what you've done. But Sarah, you have to understand that forgiveness isn't automatic. You have to earn it back. I know. And no more lies, ever, about anything. If you're struggling, you tell us. If you're in trouble, you tell us. If you're scared or ashamed or need help, you tell us. No more protecting us from your reality. I nodded, not trusting my voice. My mother squeezed my hand tighter. Where will you live if you take this position? I don't know, wherever they assign me, I suppose. You'll live with me, she said firmly, until you get back on your feet properly. Mom, you don't have to. I'm not offering charity, Sarah. I'm offering family. There's a difference. General Harrison stepped forward. Ms. Miller, your decision? I looked at Tommy, sleeping peacefully in his father's arms. He would grow up in a world I had helped make less safe through my mistakes. But maybe, if I was very lucky and worked very hard, I could also help make it safer again. I accept, I said. I accept the position, the conditions, and the chance to try to make this right. General Harrison nodded briskly. My aide will provide you with the paperwork and reporting instructions. You'll start Monday morning at Peterson Air Force Base. 8 a.m. sharp. As he turned to leave, he paused and looked back at my family. For what it's worth, Ms. Miller is fortunate to have people who love her despite her failures. That's rarer than you might think. After he left, we stood in awkward silence for several minutes. The reception was clearly over, but nobody seemed to know how to begin the process of cleaning up or saying goodbye. Finally, Rebecca spoke. "Well," she said with a shaky laugh, "this is definitely going in Tommy's baby book." Despite everything, I found myself smiling. "I'm sorry I ruined his baptism day." "You didn't ruin it," Mark said quietly. "You just made it more memorable." Sophie looked up at her mother with wide, curious eyes. "Mommy, is Aunt Sarah in trouble?" Rebecca considered the question carefully. "Yes, sweetheart. Aunt Sarah made some very big mistakes, but she's going to work very hard to fix them. Like when I have to clean my room after I make a mess? Something like that." As we began the slow process of gathering up the reception decorations, I realized that this was what second chances actually looked like. Not dramatic redemption or instant forgiveness, but the quiet work of rebuilding trust one small action at a time. Tommy woke up and began fussing, and without thinking, I reached for him. Mark hesitated for just a moment, then placed his son in my arms. The baby settled immediately, his tiny hand grasping my finger. "He still knows you," Rebecca observed softly. "He's too young to know what I've done." Maybe that's the point. Maybe we all get to start over sometimes. Standing there in the shadow of the church where my nephew had just been baptized, holding him close while my family slowly began the work of forgiving me, I finally understood what redemption might actually feel like. It didn't erase the past. It didn't make my betrayal disappear or restore what I'd lost, but it offered something almost as valuable, the possibility that my story didn't have to end with my failures. 6 months later, I stood in front of a classroom full of young Air Force officers, my hands steady on the podium despite the weight of what I was about to share. The fluorescent lights in Building 47 at Peterson Air Force Base were harsh and unforgiving. Nothing like the gentle afternoon sun that had filtered through the oak leaves at Tommy's baptism. But somehow, that felt appropriate for what I had to do here. "My name is Sarah Miller," I began, the words that had become my new ritual. "Former Colonel, United States Air Force. Dishonorably discharged for compromising national security through unauthorized disclosure of classified information to a foreign intelligence operative." The faces staring back at me were young, eager, and increasingly uncomfortable. 6 months ago, I might have been sitting in their seats, confident in my own judgment, and certain that people like me were fundamentally different from people like them. Today, we're going to discuss how good people make catastrophic decisions, and how you can recognize the warning signs before it's too late. Lieutenant Jessica Brooks raised her hand. "Ma'am, with respect, how do we know this isn't just theoretical? How do we know you're actually qualified to teach this course?" It was a fair question, one that had been asked in various forms in every class I'd taught since starting this position. The difference was that now I had an answer that went beyond my official credentials. Because 6 months ago, I was sitting in my mother's living room at 2 in the morning, explaining to her why federal agents might show up at her door. Because I've lived in a studio apartment in the worst part of town, choosing between groceries and rent. Because I've looked my family in the eye and watched their respect for me crumble in real time. The room went completely silent. The woman who recruited me was brilliant, charming, and genuinely seemed to care about me as a person. Her name was Wei Chen, and for 3 months I believed we were building something real together. By the time I realized what she actually was, the damage was done. I clicked to the next slide, showing a timeline of my relationship with Wei and the corresponding intelligence breaches that had been identified during the investigation. "Lieutenant Brooks, do you consider yourself a patriotic officer?" "Yes, ma'am." "Do you think you would ever intentionally compromise national security?" "Absolutely not." Neither did I, and that confidence, that certainty that I was different, that I was smarter, that I could never be manipulated, that's exactly what made me vulnerable. Over the past 6 months, I'd learned to use my disgrace as a teaching tool. Every painful detail of my downfall had become a case study in how foreign intelligence services targeted military personnel. The personal humiliation was still there, but it served a purpose now. The recruitment wasn't obvious. It wasn't some stranger approaching me in a dark alley offering money for secrets. It was a woman I met at a cultural exchange event, someone who seemed genuinely interested in American military culture from an academic perspective. Captain Martinez, sitting in the front row, leaned forward. How long before she started asking for specific information? 4 months. And when she did, it didn't feel like espionage. It felt like professional conversation with someone who understood my work. She'd ask about flight schedules the way you might ask a doctor about their typical day. It seemed natural, even flattering that she was so interested in my expertise. I moved to the next slide, showing the progression of information requests that had ultimately led to my downfall. The key thing to understand is that Wei was a professional. She had been trained specifically to target people like me, mid-career officers with access to operational information, but without extensive counterintelligence training. She knew exactly which psychological buttons to push. What kind of buttons? Lieutenant Brooks asked. Loneliness, professional pride, the desire to feel special and understood. I had been stationed overseas for 18 months, working long hours, with limited social connections outside the base. When someone beautiful and intelligent showed genuine interest in my work and my life, it felt like a gift. The admission still stung, but I'd learned that the sting served a purpose. If I could help even one person recognize the warning signs in their own life, then maybe my failure could prevent someone else's. The information I shared seemed harmless at the time. Maintenance schedules, general flight patterns, operational tempo. Nothing that felt classified in the moment, but when compiled over weeks of conversation, it painted a detailed picture of our capabilities and vulnerabilities. Major Davidson, who had been taking notes throughout the presentation, looked up. What was the moment you realized what was happening? The moment OSI agents knocked on my door with evidence that Wei Chen was a lieutenant in the People's Liberation Army Intelligence Division. Until that moment, I genuinely believed I was in a relationship with a civilian cultural attaché who happened to find military aviation fascinating. I clicked to a photo of Wei that had been taken during an official Chinese military ceremony. Seeing her in uniform, with her real rank displayed, still caused a twist in my stomach. This is Lieutenant Wei Chen at a commendation ceremony in Beijing, 6 months before I met her. She had been specifically trained in what the Chinese call honey trap operations, using romantic relationships to gather intelligence from foreign military personnel. The room erupted in murmurs. Several officers shook their heads in obvious disgust. The hardest part wasn't the investigation or the discharge, I continued. It was realizing that someone I had genuinely cared about had never seen me as anything more than a target. Every conversation, every intimate moment, every expression of affection had been calculated to extract information from me. Lieutenant Brooks raised her hand again. How do we protect ourselves without becoming paranoid about every relationship? It was the question I'd been hoping someone would ask. You maintain professional boundaries. You never discuss classified information outside official channels, regardless of who you're with or how much you trust them. You report any unusual interest in your work, even if it seems innocent. And most importantly, you remember that being targeted doesn't make you weak or stupid. It makes you human. I moved to the final slide, which showed statistics on foreign intelligence recruitment attempts against U.S. military personnel. Every year, hundreds of service members are approached by foreign intelligence operatives. Most recognize the threat and report it appropriately. But some, like me, get caught up in what seems like genuine personal connection and lose sight of their professional obligations. Major Davidson closed his notebook. What's your life like now, Miss Miller? I mean, after everything that happened. I paused, considering how much personal information was appropriate to share in a professional setting. But these officers needed to understand that there was life after catastrophic failure, even if it looked very different than originally planned. I live with my mother in Colorado Springs. I work here 4 days a week, teaching courses like this one and helping develop counterintelligence training materials. I see my family regularly. My nephew Tommy is walking now, and my niece Sophie has appointed herself my personal rehabilitation supervisor. A few officers chuckled at that. It's not the life I planned. I'll never wear a uniform again, never pilot military aircraft, never hold significant security clearance. But it's an honest life, and I'm helping prevent other people from making my mistakes. Some days, that feels like enough. Do you regret taking the position? Captain Martinez asked. I regret the choices that led to it, but I don't regret the opportunity to serve in a different way. My former commanding officer, Colonel Vance, gave me a second chance when she could have simply let me face federal charges. This work is my way of honoring that gift. As the session ended and officers filed out, Lieutenant Brooks approached the podium. Ms. Miller, I wanted to thank you for sharing your story. I know it can't be easy. It's not, I admitted, but it's necessary. 6 months ago, I was sitting in a church courtyard, having to explain to my entire family why I'd been lying to them for months. That was the hardest conversation of my life, but it was also the beginning of rebuilding something real. She nodded thoughtfully. Did they forgive you? They're working on it. Forgiveness isn't a one-time event. It's an ongoing process. Every day, I have to prove that I'm worthy of their trust again. Some days are better than others. After Lieutenant Brooks left, I began packing up my materials. Through the classroom window, I could see young airmen conducting training exercises on the parade ground. 6 months ago, watching them would have filled me with bitter regret for everything I'd lost. Now, I felt something different. A sense of purpose in helping protect the institution I had once betrayed. My phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. Tommy took 3 steps today without holding on to anything. Sophie says to tell Aunt Sarah he's ready for flight training. I smiled, remembering how Rebecca had barely been able to look at me 6 months ago. The text was brief, but it represented months of careful rebuilding. We still had difficult conversations sometimes, moments when the hurt and disappointment surfaced, but we were finding our way back to being sisters again. That evening, I drove to my mother's house, our house, as she insisted on calling it. She was in the kitchen preparing dinner, humming softly to herself as she worked. The sight of her contentment still sometimes caught me off guard. After all the shame I'd brought to the family name, she had simply made room for me at her table and in her life. How was class today? She asked as I hung up my jacket. Good. Difficult, but good. I think the officers are starting to understand that anyone can be vulnerable to this kind of manipulation. And how are you doing with it all? It was the question she asked every day, her way of checking on my emotional well-being without being intrusive. Better than yesterday. Not as good as I hope to be tomorrow. She smiled at my standard response and handed me a plate to set on the table. As we sat down to eat, I thought about the long journey from that devastating afternoon at Tommy's baptism to this quiet dinner in my childhood kitchen. The path to redemption hadn't been dramatic or particularly inspiring. It had been daily choices, to be honest, to show up, to do the work of rebuilding trust one small action at a time. My phone rang during dessert. The caller ID showed Colonel Vance's number. Sarah, I wanted to let you know that the training program you helped develop is being implemented at 3 more bases next month. The feedback from Peterson has been exceptional. Thank you, Colonel. That means a lot. You should be proud of what you're building there. I know it's not the career you planned, but you're making a real difference. After I hung up, my mother reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Your father would be proud of you, she said quietly. It was the first time she'd mentioned him in relation to my current situation. He had been a career Navy man who had died believing his daughter was following in his footsteps. The idea that he might somehow approve of what I was doing now, despite how I'd fallen, brought unexpected tears to my eyes. Do you really think so? I know so. He always said that a person's character isn't defined by their mistakes, but by how they respond to them. That night, as I prepared for bed in my childhood bedroom, I reflected on how different my life looked than I had ever imagined. 6 months ago, I had been preparing to lose everything. Now I had a purpose, a family that was learning to trust me again, and the possibility of a future built on truth rather than deception. It wasn't the life I had planned, but it was becoming a life I could be proud of. 1 year after Tommy's baptism, I found myself standing in the same courtyard at St. Michael's Lutheran Church. But this time, the gathering was for Sophie's 6th birthday party. The irony wasn't lost on me, returning to the place where my carefully constructed lies had crumbled, now as someone finally living in truth. The party was smaller than the baptism had been, mostly immediate family and a few of Sophie's school friends. But the atmosphere was lighter, filled with genuine laughter, rather than the polite conversation that had characterized so many family gatherings in my previous life. "Aunt Sarah," Sophie bounded over to me, her princess dress flowing behind her. "Did you bring my present?" "Of course I did, birthday girl, but you have to wait until after the cake." She groaned dramatically, a trait she'd clearly inherited from Rebecca. "Can I have a hint?" "It's something that will help you learn about the world." Her eyes lit up. Sophie had developed an insatiable curiosity about everything, constantly asking questions that challenged the adults around her to think more deeply. Last month, she'd asked me why some people lie to their families, a question that had led to a surprisingly profound conversation about trust and forgiveness. Rebecca appeared at my elbow, carrying Tommy, who was now a sturdy toddler with his father's steady demeanor and his mother's expressive eyes. "How's the new apartment?" she asked as we watched Sophie return to her friends. "Good. Strange, having my own space again after living with Mom for almost a year, but good strange." The previous month, I'd finally saved enough money to move into a small one-bedroom apartment near the base. It was modest but clean, and more importantly, it was mine, earned honestly through work I could be proud of. "Mom misses having you around," Rebecca continued, "though she'll never admit it. I miss her cooking, and her evening crossword puzzles." It was true. Living alone again had reminded me how much I valued family connection, but it had also given me space to figure out who Sarah Miller was when she wasn't defined by either military rank or family disappointment. Mark joined us, balancing paper plates and a juice box. "Sarah, I wanted to thank you for what you did last month." "What do you mean?" "The college fund advice. Setting up those education savings accounts for both kids. We never would have known about the tax advantages without you." It was a small thing, really. I'd simply shared some financial planning knowledge I'd gained from managing my own recovery. But Mark's gratitude reminded me that I had skills and experience beyond my professional mistakes. "Speaking of finances," Rebecca said carefully, "are you doing okay? I mean, really okay?" The question would have made me defensive a year ago. Now I appreciate that it came from love rather than judgment. "I'm stable. Not wealthy, but stable. The consulting work pays well enough, and I've started doing some freelance financial planning for other veterans. Turns out there's a market for someone who understands both military benefits and personal financial disasters." Tommy reached for me, and I took him from Rebecca's arms. He immediately grabbed my necklace, a simple silver chain that had belonged to my grandmother. It was one of the few valuable things I hadn't sold during my months of unemployment. "Uncle David was asking about you earlier," Rebecca said. "He wants to know if you'll come to his company picnic next month." "What did you tell him?" "That you'd probably say yes, since you don't hide from family events anymore." She was right. One of the unexpected benefits of having all my secrets exposed was that I no longer had to craft excuses or maintain elaborate deceptions. If I didn't want to attend something, I could simply say so. If I was struggling financially or emotionally, I could be honest about it. The freedom of truth had been a revelation. My mother approached our little group, carrying a camera and wearing the pleased expression she got when all her children were in the same place at the same time. "Sarah, sweetheart, would you help me with the candles? These old eyes aren't what they used to be." As we walked toward the cake table together, she lowered her voice. "I'm proud of how far you've come this year." "Thanks, Mom, for everything. I know it wasn't easy having your adult daughter move back home after everything. You're my daughter. That doesn't change based on circumstances." The simplicity of her love still caught me off guard sometimes. After decades of measuring my worth through achievements and accolades, it was humbling to be valued simply for existing. We lit Sophie's candles together, 6+1 for good luck. As the family gathered around to sing, I found myself looking at each face. Rebecca trying to keep Tommy from grabbing the cake, Mark documenting everything with his phone, David and Jennifer corralling their twins, Uncle Robert actually smiling for once, various cousins and their children forming the extended circle of belonging I'd almost lost. When Sophie blew out her candles, she closed her eyes tight and made a wish with the seriousness of someone who truly believed in magic. What did you wish for? Rebecca asked. Can't tell, or it won't come true, Sophie replied with authority. Then she grinned mischievously. But I can tell you it wasn't for a pony. After the cake was distributed and present opening commenced, I found myself sitting at the same table where I'd hidden during Tommy's baptism. But this time I wasn't alone. Sophie had claimed the chair next to me, excited to show me how well she could read the birthday cards. Aunt Sarah, she said, looking up from a card covered in glittery stickers, are you happy now? The question was so direct, so innocent, and so profound that it took me a moment to formulate an answer. I'm happier than I was a year ago, I said finally. And I'm learning that happiness isn't something you achieve once and keep forever. It's something you work on every day. She considered this seriously. Like brushing your teeth? Exactly like brushing your teeth. You have to do it regularly, or things get messy. She giggled at the comparison, then leaned against my arm to continue reading her cards. The simple weight of her trust, her automatic assumption that I belonged in this moment, felt like the greatest gift I'd received in years. Later, as the party wound down and we cleaned up the courtyard, Rebecca pulled me aside. I have something to tell you, she said, her voice carrying a mix of excitement and nervousness. What's going on? Mark and I are pregnant again, due in February. The news hit me with unexpected emotion. Another baby, another new beginning, another chance for this family to grow and heal. Rebecca, that's wonderful. How are you feeling? Terrified, excited, nauseated. The usual. But Sarah, I want to ask you something. Anything. Would you consider being the godmother? I know things were complicated during Tommy's baptism. But you're different now. We're all different now. And I want this baby to know the real you, the person you've become. The honor of her request left me speechless for a moment. To go from the person hiding in the back pew to someone trusted with spiritual responsibility for a child, it felt like a completion of some cosmic circle. I would be honored, I managed. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this place. A year ago, I'd sat in that same courtyard convinced that my life was over, that there was no path forward from the choices I'd made. I'd been wrong about a lot of things, but mostly I'd been wrong about the possibility of redemption. The work wasn't finished. I still woke up some mornings with regret over the opportunities I'd lost and the people I'd hurt. I still dealt with the professional limitations of my past and the ongoing challenge of rebuilding trust, but I'd learned something valuable in the process. Redemption wasn't about erasing the past or returning to some previous version of yourself. It was about becoming someone new, someone better, someone worthy of the second chances you'd been given. My phone buzzed with a text from Colonel Vance. Congratulations on the Pentagon assignment. Your counterintelligence training program is being implemented service-wide next year. I pulled over to read the message properly. Next month, I'd be traveling to Washington to present my training materials to senior military leadership. It was recognition beyond anything I'd hoped for when I'd first accepted this position. But as I sat there in my modest car, thinking about the day I'd just shared with my family, I realized that the professional achievement felt secondary to the personal ones. Sophie's easy affection, Rebecca's trust in asking me to be a godmother, my mother's quiet pride, even Uncle Robert's grudging acceptance. These were the victories that truly mattered. Driving through the familiar streets of Colorado Springs, I thought about the woman I'd been and the woman I was becoming. The transformation hadn't been dramatic or inspiring in the way movies might portray it. It had been daily choices, small acts of honesty, gradual rebuilding of trust, and the slow recognition that identity could be rebuilt from the ground up. At Tommy's baptism, General Harrison had given me a choice between prosecution and redemption. I'd chosen redemption, but I'd had no idea what that actually meant. Now I understood that redemption wasn't a destination but a daily practice. The ongoing work of being worthy of the love and trust that had been offered to me. As I pulled into my apartment complex, I smiled at the sight of the small American flag hanging by my front door. Not because I'd returned to military service, but because I'd found a new way to serve my country, not as Colonel Miller, but as Sarah Miller, a woman who'd made terrible mistakes and spent every day since trying to prevent others from making the same ones. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was a life I'd earned through honesty, humility, and the grace of people who'd chosen to love me despite my failures. And for the first time in years, that felt like enough. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.